The Baltic Sea, at 3:17 a.m. in late November, is not a sea anyone chooses to be above. A shallow inland basin, 2 degrees above freezing at the surface, covered from horizon to horizon in a solid overcast at 4,000 feet that extends in unbroken gray wool up to 28,000 feet. Above the cloud deck, the sky is crystalline and absolute, minus 58 degrees Celsius at altitude, visibility unlimited, stars burning with the hard precision of objects seen through air that contains almost no moisture. Contrails persist for 40 minutes at these temperatures. Every aircraft above 30,000 feet draws a white line across the darkness that an AWACS radar operator can read like handwriting. This is the problem. At 3:17 a.m., the E-3C Sentry orbiting at 29,000 feet over the central Baltic picked up 4 radar returns climbing from Kaliningrad Oblast, the Russian exclave wedged between Poland and Lithuania on the Baltic's southern coast. The contacts were climbing fast, military power from the outset, and they were spreading laterally as they climbed, not staying in formation but pushing apart, each aircraft increasing its distance from the others until the spacing reached 65 kilometers between the outermost contacts. The formation stretched across 195 kilometers of airspace from east to west. The radar operator had seen this geometry before. Everyone in the NATO air picture had seen it. 4 Su-35S Flanker-Es in combat wall formation, designed to sweep maximum radar coverage across the ADIZ boundary like a net being dragged through water. Every aircraft in the wall was carrying the Irbis-E PESA radar, each with a track range against non-stealth targets exceeding 300 kilometers. 4 of them in line abreast, separated by 65 kilometers each, created an overlapping radar coverage wall nearly 400 kilometers wide. Anything trying to approach through that wall would be detected at range and forced to address all 4 contacts simultaneously. It had worked against NATO fighters over the Baltic 3 times in the past 14 months. The defenders had split their intercept forces to address the spread, thinned their own formation, and arrived at the merge point without positional advantage. At 3:17 a.m., the wall was climbing through 18,000 feet, heading 285 degrees, directly toward the Estonian ADIZ boundary. At Mach 0.95, they would reach the boundary in 11 minutes. At 3:17 a.m., 2 F-35Cs were already airborne. They had been airborne for 19 minutes. Launched from USS Gerald R. Ford, operating in the central Baltic during a NATO exercise that had, until 40 seconds ago, been a routine transit. The exercise had a name. The intercept did not. It would be filed under a designator that no press release would ever carry. The 2 pilots had been holding a combat air patrol station at 38,000 feet, above the overcast, burning fuel at $12,000 per hour each while the Baltic exercise proceeded below. The total cost of their 2 aircraft cap, by the time the contacts appeared on the Link 16 feed, $7,600. The cost of what was coming, significantly more. At 3:17 a.m., the lead pushed the nose onto a bearing of 097 and advanced both throttles. The catapult shot was already 19 minutes in the past. That violence of acceleration already metabolized, the body normalized to flight. What remained was the clinical attention of a pilot in the BVR phase. Radar picture, fuel state, Link 16 data from the Sentry, own position relative to the wall's projected track. The wingman was 3 kilometers to the left and 500 feet low, close enough for mutual support, far enough that a single acquisition would not catch both aircraft in the same detection cone. The AN/APG-81 radar was in passive mode. No emissions. The EW suite was listening. What it heard was considerable. 4 Irbis-E PESA radars, all active, all in long-range search mode, sweeping forward. The emissions were powerful, well separated in frequency, and utterly distinctive in their pulse pattern. a Russian radar technology that NATO intelligence had been cataloging for years. The EW display showed 4 distinct emitters bearing 097, ranges between 287 and 312 kilometers, closing at Mach 0.95. At this range, the Irbis-E was searching for targets. It had not found anything yet. At 287 kilometers, the F-35C's passive sensor suite was already tracking all 4 of them. None of the 4 Su-35 pilots knew anything was there. The lead keyed the tactical discrete. Falcon 2, Falcon lead. Picture: 4 contacts bearing 097, range 285 kilometers. Wall formation, 65-kilometer spacing, climbing through 22,000. Assess VKS Flanker-Es 4-ship combat wall. ADIZ boundary in 9 minutes at current closure. Falcon lead 2. Copy. Fuel state bingo plus 31. Ready. Bingo plus 31. 31 minutes of fuel above minimum safe recovery. The intercept would consume fuel at a rate the pre-mission planning had modeled to the minute. At the planned geometry, both aircraft would recover with bingo plus 6, a margin that would make the air boss uncomfortable and the maintenance chief ask questions. It was workable. The wingman moved left another kilometer, opening the lateral separation to 4 kilometers. The 2 F-35Cs were now a spread formation approaching a wall of 4, a geometry that looked, on a tactical display, like 2 fish swimming toward a net. The appearance was deliberate and misleading. What the tactical display did not show was the difference in sensor capability between the 2 sides. The wall was sweeping its radars forward and finding empty sky. The 2 F-35Cs were passively tracking all 4 wall members with the precision of a system designed to do exactly this from exactly this range. At 240 kilometers, the lead cross-checked the tactical picture against the Sentry's Link 16 feed. The 2 pictures agreed. 4 contacts, wall formation, now at 26,000 feet, speed steady at Mach 0.95, heading unchanged at 285. They were not deviating. The wall was driving straight toward the ADIZ boundary with the confidence of a formation that believed it had the radar advantage. It had the radar advantage against everything it had encountered before. At 200 kilometers, the lead began to work the geometry. The wall's design had a structural weakness that required patience to exploit. The 65-kilometer spacing between contacts was the wall's strength in coverage, but its vulnerability in mutual support. Any aircraft in the wall was 65 kilometers from its nearest wingman. At 200 kilometers range and the current closure geometry, an aircraft at the center of the wall could not communicate a radar detection to its flanking aircraft in time to coordinate a response before the threat geometry had already changed. The wall was wide and fast and powerful, and if you approached it from exactly the right angle, it could be penetrated 1 contact at a time. The lead had calculated the angle. The approach vector was not 097, not directly into the wall's face. It was 084, offset 13 degrees to the north, aimed at the gap between the northernmost contact and the next one in the formation. 13 degrees of offset at 200 kilometers put the F-35Cs in a corridor where neither flanking contact's Irbis-E radar would be looking at the moment of closest approach. The center contacts would detect them, if they could detect them at all. The flanking contacts would be pointing their radar coverage in the wrong direction. At 3:24 a.m., the lead turned to 084. The wingman matched the turn without a word on the radio. They had briefed this approach in the ready room 3 hours earlier. The VKS combat wall was a known tactic with a known counter. The counter required patience, precise positioning, and an aircraft that could approach 200 kilometers of active radar coverage without being seen. The F-35C's frontal radar cross-section against the Irbis-E PESA at this geometry was estimated at less than the noise floor. Not a small return, but a return indistinguishable from atmospheric clutter at extended range. The wall was looking for fighter-sized returns.
It was not looking for nothing.
It was finding nothing.
At 160 kilometers, the second Su-35 from the north, the aircraft that would be directly in the F-35C's path as the gap was threaded, increased its radar scan rate. The Irbis-E shifted from standard long-range search to an elevated frequency mode that the EW suite flagged immediately. The Russian pilot was getting something on the edge of his display, not a clear return but an anomaly in the clutter that his experience was telling him to investigate.
The lead noted it, did not react, held the vector.
At 140 kilometers, the anomaly resolved into nothing. The Irbis-E dropped back to standard search mode. The Su-35 pilot had seen something at the edge of his detection envelope, investigated it, and found clutter. He had been looking at an F-35C at 140 kilometers and had been unable to confirm it as a target. His training had told him to investigate. His radar had told him there was nothing there.
Both were correct. Neither was useful to him.
At 120 kilometers, the lead activated the AN/APG-81 in low probability of intercept mode, not against the closest contact. Against contact 3, the second from the south end of the wall, the aircraft that would be out of useful communications range with the northern contacts for the next 4 minutes of geometry. LPI mode, compressed burst transmissions, sub-millisecond dwell time, frequency hopping pattern that the Irbis-E's DRFM jamming system was not designed to detect at this geometry. The fire control solution on contact 3 resolved in 2.3 seconds, range 119 kilometers, altitude 28,400 feet, heading 285, speed Mach 0.94. AIM-120D solution, valid. Confidence, high. Contact 3's RWR received nothing. The LPI emissions were below its detection threshold. The lead logged the solution and let it decay. Not employed. Not yet. The purpose of the solution was intelligence, confirming the LPI detection range against this specific aircraft in these specific conditions. The number would go into a database before the day was out. Future engagements would be shaped by what was learned tonight.
Falcon lead, sentry. ADIZ boundary in 4 minutes at current rate. Contacts maintaining heading and speed. No change. Sentry Falcon lead. Copy. In position. At 100 kilometers, the geometry arrived.
The gap between contact 1 and contact 2, the two northernmost Su-35s, was 63 kilometers of airspace at 28,000 feet, stretching from bearing 081 to bearing 088 from Viper 1's current position. The F-35Cs were at bearing 084 from both contacts, precisely centered in the gap, approaching at Mach 1.1, the airframe vibrating with the characteristic resonance of supersonic flight in cold, dense air at altitude. The Irbis-E of contact 1 was pointing 22 degrees to the left. The Irbis-E of contact 2 was pointing 28 degrees to the right. Neither radar was covering the corridor that the two F-35Cs were currently occupying. They passed through the gap at 3:29 a.m. 1 second, the wall was ahead. The next second, 2 of the 4 contacts were behind. Contact 1 48 kilometers behind and to the right. Contact 2 51 kilometers behind and to the left. The lead and wingman were now inside the wall, behind the line, on the same side of the formation as Kaliningrad.
In the geometry of the wall's defensive design, this position did not exist.
Falcon 2, position check. The lead's voice, flat, precise, the verbal equivalent of a diagnostic readout.
Falcon lead 2. Inside the wall, 49 kilometers south of contact 1, 52 north of contact 2. Contacts 3 and 4 bearing 097 at 85 kilometers. Wall integrity compromised.
The wall was still intact as a formation. All 4 Su-35s were still flying their headings, still sweeping their radars forward toward NATO airspace. But the 2 aircraft tasked with defending the northern half of the wall were now behind an adversary they did not know was there. Contact 1 and Contact 2 were pointing their radar coverage forward, into the airspace the F-35Cs had just vacated. At 3:30 a.m., the lead turned to 180, directly south, and activated the AN/APG-81 at full tactical power.
Not LPI, not passive. Full AESA emission tracking mode, Contact 2 at 51 kilometers. A hard, precise, unambiguous radar lock from a bearing that Contact 2's own radar showed as NATO airspace, the airspace the wall had just passed. The fire control solution resolved in under 1 second. Range 51.3 kilometers, altitude 28,200 feet, heading 285, speed Mach 0.94. AIM-120D solution parameters, all green. The SPO-150 Pastel RWR in Contact 2's cockpit screamed. The tone was not in the warning tone library as a known NATO emitter. It was not in the known F-15 or F-16 signature database. It was a high-frequency, high-confidence track mode lock from bearing 097, the direction they had just come from behind the wall, from NATO airspace, from an aircraft that the wall's combined radar coverage had never detected at any point in the approach. The Su-35 pilot's hand moved to the ECM panel in the same instant his RIO's hand moved to the radio. 3 seconds of instinct competing with training before training. 1. The RIO transmitted on the formation frequency. In those 3 seconds, the lead had already turned the APG-81 onto Contact 1 at 48 kilometers north. New lock. New fire control solution. Both northernmost contacts locked simultaneously. One tracked by the lead, one tracked by the wingman who had activated his own radar in the same instant. Contact 1's RWR joined the frequency. 48 kilometers. 51 kilometers. Both northern Su-35s locked from behind. By aircraft they could not locate. Using a radar mode their warning systems could not identify with confidence. The ECM panels on both aircraft were active, DRFM jammers engaging, attempting to break the lock by flooding the tracking radar with false returns. The AN/APG-81's electronic countermeasures processed the jamming signal and maintained track. The lock degraded from high confidence to medium confidence. It did not break. The jamming cost the wall something it could not easily recover. 4 seconds of coordinated decision time while the pilots processed the threat, activated ECM, and attempted to acquire the source. In those 4 seconds, the geometry had moved. The F-35Cs were no longer at the positions the RWR bearings suggested. They had maneuvered during the ECM response, maintaining lock while shifting the angular position. At 3:31 a.m., Contact 3, 78 kilometers to the south, still forward of the ADIZ boundary and unaware of what was happening to the northern pair, increased to afterburner. Not a coordinated formation response. An individual pilot reaction to the formation frequency transmission from Contact 2. He had heard the report. He was pressing the throttle before he had a picture. The wingman turned south. At 78 kilometers, Contact 3's Irbis-E was now in the wingman's forward hemisphere, a geometry where the Su-35's large radar cross-section of approximately 10 square meters was presented at its maximum aspect. The APG-81 locked Contact 3 in 1.1 seconds. AIM-120D solution. Valid, range 76 kilometers. The wingman called the lock on the tactical discrete.
Fox 3 valid on Contact 3. Range 76. Not employed. Falcon 2 lead. Maintain track. Do not employ. 3 of 4 wall contacts were now locked. Contact 4, the southernmost aircraft, was still in standard search mode, pointing its Irbis-E forward, unaware that the formation had been penetrated from the rear, that 3 of its 4 aircraft were locked by systems it hadn't detected, and that the geometry of the wall, the geometry that had taken 11 months of operational development to refine, had been inverted. At 3:32 a.m., 15 seconds after Contact 2's RWR first sounded, the wall began to break. Contact 2 turned. Not a coordinated 180, a hard right bank, 5G, nose pulling southeast, away from the lock bearing. Afterburner on both engines, the Su-35's twin AL-41 F-1S engines, pushing 14,500 kilograms of thrust each into the cold Baltic air. The aircraft accelerated through Mach 1.0, contrail cutting a sharp line across the overcast below. At 5G with a 23-kilogram helmet, the G-suit compressed hard against the pilot's legs and abdomen, peripheral vision narrowing at the edges as the cranial pressure in the vessels fought the centrifugal acceleration. The AGSM, the anti-G straining maneuver. Every muscle below the chest clenched, a sharp, controlled exhale against a closed throat, forcing circulation to remain in the brain. The technique that separates a trained pilot from unconsciousness at sustained high G. The Russian pilot executed it correctly. He had done it 10,000 times in a career built around this aircraft.
He was going home.
Contact 1 broke 8 seconds later. A mirror image turned to the left, northwest, away from the wingman's lock bearing. The turn was also 5G, also afterburner, also contrail drawing against the star-bright sky above the overcast. Two aircraft, 48 and 51 kilometers away, turning simultaneously away from adversaries they could not locate, putting distance between themselves and a situation their training had not prepared them for.
Contact 3, now locked by the wingman at 74 kilometers, held its southward heading for 4 more seconds. 4 seconds is a long time to maintain course after your formation has broken. It is the duration of a professional pilot processing a scenario his briefing had not included. His wall formation had been penetrated from the rear by aircraft that hadn't registered on any radar during the approach. 3 of his 4 aircraft were now reacting to locks. He couldn't confirm on his own sensors, and the correct tactical response was not yet clear. At 3:32 a.m. and 11 seconds, Contact 3 turned southeast. Not afterburner immediately. A measured 4G turn, the pilot selecting a heading that would take him toward Kaliningrad, while keeping his Irbis-E pointed in the direction the threat bearing had come from. Trying to acquire on the way out. The Irbis-E swept the sector behind the wall's former position. It found nothing. The wingman maintained lock through the turn, tracking Contact 3 as the range opened through 79, 82, 88 kilometers. The fire control solution degraded smoothly as the aspect angle shifted, not lost, not broken, just following the geometry of a receding target. At 90 kilometers, the solution passed below optimal parameters and the wingman released lock. The contact was going home. Contact 4 broke without instruction at 3:33 a.m. The formation frequency had been active for 90 seconds. Whatever was being said on it was not available to the Sentry's operators. Encrypted, frequency hopped, built around keys that NATO Signals Intelligence was actively working to characterize. What was available was the behavior. Contact 4 turned southeast at 3:33 a.m. Afterburner, climbing through 30,000 feet, contrail bright against the darkness. All 4 contacts were aggressing. The lead held passive track on Contact 1 until the range reached 140 kilometers. At 140 kilometers, outbound, afterburner, the Irbis-E still sweeping the airspace behind and below the flight path, still looking for what had found it. Not finding anything. At 140 kilometers outbound, the lead released track and turned to 270, west, toward the Marshall Stack and USS Gerald R. Ford. Fuel state, bingo +9. 7 minutes more than planning had predicted. The engagement had been shorter than the conservative model. The APG-81 went to standby. No emissions. The Baltic above the overcast was silent and starlit and empty again. At 3:41 a.m., passing 36,000 feet on the descent, the lead transmitted on the Sentry frequency. Sentry, Falcon lead. 4 contacts egressing, all bearing southeast, range 190 and opening. A DIZ boundary,
not crossed. Recommend continued monitoring. RTB in progress. Falcon lead sentry. Copy all. Good work.
Good work. 2 words that covered 11 minutes of geometry, 19 minutes of pre-intercept positioning, and the patience of approaching 400 kilometers of active radar coverage without making a sound. It was what the intelligence package sent up the chain tomorrow morning would expand to 4 hours of data review.
Below the overcast, the Baltic was invisible. Above it, 2 F-35Cs were descending through the crystalline cold, contrails unspooling behind them in the windless air, white lines being written across the darkness that would persist for another 30 minutes before the temperature differential finally erased them. The first friction event had come at 3:24 a.m., 7 minutes into the intercept, when the wingman's targeting pod gimbal hit its travel limit during a corrective maneuver to maintain the gap-threading geometry. The pod had recovered in 12 seconds. 12 seconds of degraded sensor picture during the most precise positioning phase of the approach. The wingman had cross-checked with the APG-81 passive mode and held position. The geometry had survived. The debrief would note the gimbal limit as a system constraint in cold air, high-altitude operations, and the maintenance log would add a note. No one would assign it a significance beyond that. It had been 12 seconds. But at the speed this engagement moved, 12 seconds of degraded picture was not trivially small. The second friction event had been the ECM response at 3:31 a.m. The DRFM jammers on Contact 2 had been more capable than the mission planning had assessed as likely. The lock degradation from high confidence to medium confidence had lasted 4.1 seconds before the countermeasures restored the track. 4.1 seconds at the geometry of that moment was enough time for a skilled pilot to execute a significant heading change. Contact 2 had used some of those 4.1 seconds to break. A slightly better jammer or a slightly earlier activation, and the geometry might have been different enough to matter. That note would also be in the debrief. The ECM assessment would be updated. The recovery aboard USS Gerald R. Ford at 4:03 a.m. was executed in darkness, in the rolling Baltic chop that made every carrier landing a different version of the same problem. The meatball at the end of the glide slope, the alignment corrections in the final seconds, the arrest at the 3-wire, the deceleration, the canopy coming open to Baltic air that was cold and carrying salt, and the smell of seawater and aviation fuel that defines every carrier flight deck on Earth. The lead sat for 3 seconds. Heart rate, 141. Not the spike of a merge, not the raw adrenaline of a close-range engagement. The quieter physiological cost of sustained precision work, 46 minutes of exact positioning, passive tracking, geometry calculation, and the controlled tension of approaching a wall of 4 radar systems without making a sound. The post-sortie drop was the same regardless of the engagement type. The body did not distinguish between the violence of a merge and the sustained demand of an extended BVR approach. It was tired in the same ways. The 4 Su-35 pilots were somewhere over the Baltic, descending toward Kaliningrad. They had executed a sophisticated tactic with professional precision and found it inverted by aircraft they never located. The debrief at Kaliningrad would be technical and exact. These were skilled professionals, not conscripts. The electronic recording of their RWR data would show a lock signature the system could not identify with confidence. The approach track of the intercepting aircraft would show nothing. No radar emissions detected during approach. Lock from an unconfirmed bearing. Duration of engagement from first RWR tone to last contact, 94 seconds. 94 seconds to break a wall formation that had taken 11 months and 3 successful operations to build. Somewhere in that Kaliningrad debrief, an intelligence officer was asking the question that mattered. What did they have that we couldn't see? The answer to that question would shape the next 11 months of VKS Baltic operations. Every answer they arrived at would be one data point in a larger intelligence picture that NATO was building and Russia was building simultaneously. A picture of capability, limitation, and the distance between the two that was either closing or widening depending on which side's numbers you used. That distance was measured in radar returns and their absence. Tonight, it had been measured in 2 aircraft that passed through 400 kilometers of active radar coverage and were never once confirmed as targets. 4 Su-35S Flanker-Es, 2 F-35C Lightning IIs, 38,000 feet, 195-kilometer wall formation, 11 minutes from first detection to ADIZ boundary. Airspace yielded 0. Ordnance employed 0. Wall formation penetrated confirmed. Message delivered: the wall has a gap and someone on the other side knows exactly where it is. At 4:03 a.m., the Baltic above the overcast was empty. The contrails from 4 Su-35s and 2 F-35Cs were already beginning to spread and dissolve in the high-altitude wind, their edges softening from sharp lines to broad white bands to faint diffuse streaks. In 90 minutes they would be gone entirely, and the sky above the Baltic would show no evidence that anything had happened there.
That is how it works. That is exactly how it is designed to work.
The sky keeps no record. The radar tapes do.